Have you ever witnessed a moment where man and wild beast stood together, not as enemies, but as family? Deep in Bitter Creek Valley, a storm raged and a young Mustang foal was drowning. Jace Callahan, a lone cowboy with nothing but his black stallion Onyx and his courage, plunged into the raging waters. What happened next would defy everything we thought we knew about wild horses, and it will leave you breathless. Where are you watching this story from today? Leave a comment below. May your day be blessed with peace. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of courage, faith, and the bond between humans and animals. The sun burned hot over Bitter Creek, a small town clinging to dust and stubborn will. Streets lay quiet, but the auction yard roared with voices. Men leaned on rails, silver dollars jingled, and horses tossed their heads under the weight of judgment. It was a day when fortunes shifted on the swing of a hammer. Jace Callahan pushed through the crowd, tall and broad-shouldered, every step steady. At 32, years of ranch work had carved muscle onto his frame. His face carried the mark of wind and sun, jaw square beneath a shadow of stubble. Pale blue eyes studied everything, calm but alert. Beside him walked Onyx, his black Mustang stallion, 10 years old, strong as tempered steel, scar on his shoulder from a storm long past. Jace kept the bosal short, guiding him carefully. A stallion in a crowd was no toy, and Jace knew how to handle power. Sheriff Walt Danner leaned on the rail nearby, his silver mustache bristling. Age had softened his waistline, but not his eyes. Those brown eyes had once watched Jace's father ride the range, and the memory still weighed on him. Walt nodded, low voice carrying, "Don't throw money after something already lost." At the far edge of the yard stood a chestnut Mustang. His coat, once red-brown, had dulled to rust. Ribs pressed sharp against his hide, his mane a tangle, his right ear torn. Scars marked his legs like maps of old cruelty. He barely lifted his head, as though waiting to be forgotten. Rachel Vaughn stood across the pen, elegant in her dark jacket and polished boots. Her green eyes, cold and precise, kept slipping from the horses to the red hills beyond town. Her clerk carried a leather tube of rolled surveys. Rachel's smile was thin, the kind that saw profits where others saw ruin. Derek Alden, lean and sharp, tipped his hat at Jace with a smirk. "That bag of bones? You'll bury him before the frost." Derek owed Rachel money and bent easily to her plans. His words always carried more pride than kindness. The auctioneer, Silas Boone, raised his voice. "Lot 43, chestnut Mustang gelding, hard miles, no reserve. Who'll give me 15? Silence. 10, 5. The crowd shifted, uninterested. Feed was dear this year. No one wasted hay on a hopeless mouth. 3? Silas asked at last. A chuckle rippled through the men, then Jace lifted his hand. His voice was steady. 3. Laughter burst. Someone muttered, "Fool's bargain." Derek shook his head, enjoying the spectacle. At that moment, the chestnut raised his head. His amber eyes met Jace's across the dust. In them was not defeat, but intelligence, something sharp, alive, waiting. Jace felt the spark catch. Silas slammed his hammer. "Sold. $3 to Callahan." Rachel's lips curled in secret amusement. Derek spat in the dirt. Walt only sighed, as if watching history repeat. But Jace stepped forward, rope in hand, calm as stone. He touched the Mustang's neck, speaking low. "Easy, boy. You've got fire yet." Onyx lowered his head a rail away, breathing out softly. The chestnut's ears flicked, his poll loosened, and for a heartbeat he shared a breath of truce. Jace looked into him and thought of rust and fire. The name was waiting. Derek leaned close with mockery. "When he breaks you, I'll buy him cheap." Jace's voice was quiet but sharp. "If he breaks anything, Derek, it'll be your smug smile." Walt stepped nearer, warning low. "Eyes are on you, son. Some to laugh, some to take. I rode fence with your father once. Keep your doors locked. Storms are coming." Beyond the pens, 2 men in fine coats studied a map, glancing often toward the hills. Rachel's gaze followed. The chestnut, too, once outside the yard, planted his hooves and turned his eyes to the ridge. Onyx pricked his ears the same way, as if both Mustangs shared a secret. Thunderheads stacked on the horizon, dark blue and heavy. Jace tugged the rope gently. "Not tonight," he murmured. "Tonight you'll drink slow, hay in small bites, no grain till morning. Tomorrow we see what you're pointing at." The horse blinked once and stepped forward. Jace, Onyx, and the battered chestnut walked into the lengthening shadows, with thunder rolling like a drum far away. Morning dragged itself out of the storm like a wounded animal, the sky a pale, bruised gray over the Wyoming valley. Bitter Creek still raged, its surface broken with logs and froth, though the worst of the flood had ebbed. On the bank, Jace Callahan crouched, soaked through, his breath clouding in the cold air. Beside him, Onyx stood steady, black hide slick with rain, eyes watchful. At their feet, the chestnut foal trembled under the borrowed weight of Jace's wool coat. Its ribs rose and fell unevenly, but each breath came a little stronger than the last. Jace had guided it into a hollow by looping his rope around chest and haunch, dragging it up the mud until it lay clear of the sucking water. His arms still shook with the memory of the current, his body numbed, but he did not move away. His hand stayed on the colt's neck, feeling life where moments ago there had nearly been none. Across the creek the herd lingered. 24 wild mustangs darkened by rain stood shoulder to shoulder. The mares shifted uneasily, their yearlings pressed close to their flanks, while the stallion at the center, huge, black-brown, his mane plastered to his neck, kept his gaze pinned on Jace. It was not rage, not yet. It was a scrutiny that weighed him like stone weighs a scale. Jace neither challenged nor bowed. He simply met the gaze with the calm steadiness of a man who had nothing to hide. The foal coughed, shook its small head, and struggled to its knees. Jace steadied it, murmuring low so the tone, not the words, would settle its panic. Onyx lowered his muzzle and brushed the colt's mane, a gesture of reassurance that seemed to anchor them all. For a brief span, the valley breathed in stillness, man and horse and wild creatures bound by the single fact that the foal lived. Far downstream, the storm's voice carried to town. Bitter Creek was little more than 2 muddy streets, a church steeple, and the wooden fronts of shops weathered by 100 winters. News traveled here not by paper but by mouth, quick as sparks in dry grass. By mid-morning, Luke Pritchard, a ranch hand still wet from river mud, shouldered through the mercantile door and blurted the tale. Callahan went into the flood and pulled a wild foal out alive. Within minutes, the story spilled into the street, swelled with every telling. Some called it madness, others shook their heads in disbelief, and by the time the porch of the general store filled with ranchers, the judgment had already begun. They stood in a knot under the awning, broad-shouldered men in wool vests, hats dripping rainwater. Faces carved by wind and sun carried little softness. "A man risks his neck for a mustang?" one muttered. "Fool's errand. Wild stock's worth less than the rope he near drowned with." Another spat tobacco into the mud and nodded. "That Callahan spends too much time with beasts, and not near enough with men." Their voices carried the weight of certainty, the kind that resists change. Ethan Vaughn heard this all. 11 years old, slim and restless, hair a black tumble, hazel eyes bright with stubborn fire, he planted himself in front of them, though the hem of his shirt still showed his sister's careful stitching. The younger brother of Clara Vaughn, the widowed seamstress who stitched half the town's coats by lamplight, Ethan had the habit of speaking when silence was safer. His chin jutted forward now, fists curled tight at his sides. "You talk like he's a fool," Ethan said, voice thin but sharp enough to cut through the grumble. "But while you hid from rain, he went in and pulled life out of the river. You think that's nothing? You ever hold a rope against water like that? You ever see a mustang stand still and trust a man not to let go?" The boy's words trembled with anger, but also with something more memory. Last spring, Jace had returned Ethan's torn kite, the frame mended by hand, no coin taken. "Keep it flying, kid," he'd said, and Ethan had never forgotten. The oldest rancher, gray-bearded and thick-set, leaned forward, unimpressed. "Courage don't put bread on your table, boy. Mustangs don't pay for feed." His laugh was heavy with scorn. Ethan felt heat rise in his chest, but he forced his feet to stay. He was small among them, but his words came out steady. "Maybe courage don't pay for feed. But what's your bread worth if you've got no heart to spend it with?" For a breath, no one answered. The porch air grew tight, heavy with the weight of pride and doubt. Then slowly, some turned away, unwilling to argue with a boy too young to know fear. Ethan stood his ground until the moment passed, then shoved his hands into his pockets and walked off, mud splashing his boots. In his chest, something burned brighter than pride, a belief that Jace Callahan was not a fool, but something closer to a rare kind of man. Back at the swollen creek, Jace rose to his feet, soaked and weary but unbroken. The foal wobbled upright beside him, its legs trembling like reeds in the current, yet holding. He kept the rope loose over its shoulders, steadying it without trapping it, guiding it toward a patch of dry grass. The colt shook itself, mane scattering droplets, and leaned against his side as though instinctively aware that this man was safety. The stallion across the water stamped once, sending spray into the air. He let out a call, low and resonant, and the herd shifted in response. Mares whickered, yearlings stirred, but none stepped away. They had seen what the man had done. Jace felt the recognition in their stillness, though it was unspoken, fragile as morning light. He pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders, met the stallion's eyes one last time, and inclined his head slightly, not as a challenge, not as surrender, but as respect. By early afternoon, the clouds broke apart, leaving threads of sunlight that spilled across the valley. Steam lifted from Onyx's dark hide. The foal grazed weakly on the grass, its breaths steady, its coat glinting chestnut red in the new light. Across the torrent the herd lingered, their leader unmoving, until slowly they turned upstream, their silhouettes fading into mist. Jace stood with his Mustang, the rescued foal at his side, and listened to the hush after storm. He knew the town might scorn him, might call his act folly, but here at the water's edge the truth had weight, a life saved, a herd that had witnessed, and a bond, fragile and new, stretching like a thread between his solitude and something greater. By late afternoon, the storm had loosened its grip, leaving Bitter Creek Valley wrapped in mist and light the color of old silver. The air was raw with the smell of pine resin and wet earth, every surface slick from the endless rain. Jace Callahan stood on the bank with mud tugging at his boots, Onyx breathing steady at his shoulder, and the chestnut foal trembling at his side. The creek still roared, swollen from the storm, but no longer as wild as it had been hours earlier. Across the torrent the herd waited, pacing, calling, every muzzle turned toward the smallest among them. The foal's mother, a bay mare marked with a blaze of white, stretched her neck and cried again, desperate for reunion. Jace read the scene with the instincts of a man who had spent half his life outdoors. The young Mustang could not make the crossing alone. Fear was already etched into its trembling limbs, its memory of drowning still fresh. Yet, to leave it on the wrong bank was to abandon it to a death almost certain. He scanned downstream and found what the herd had already seen, the broken trunk of a cottonwood, fallen in the storm, stretching nearly across the water. It stopped short of the far bank, leaving a furious gap, but it was the only bridge nature had offered. Onyx shifted, ears pricked, the black Mustang calm and unwavering. Jace felt the steadiness of his horse settle into his own chest. He coiled a rope, slipped a loop carefully under the foal's belly and haunches, never near the neck, and tied it off with a quick-release knot. He spoke in a low voice meant more for rhythm than words, easing the young horse toward the log. The trunk was slick with moss and rain, so Jace climbed first, keeping 3 points of contact, rope loose in one hand to guide but never drag. The foal balked at the edge, eyes wide, hooves scrabbling, until the chorus of anxious whinnies from across the creek urged it forward. Step by step it followed, every slip caught by Jace's steady hand, Onyx waiting below like a dark sentinel. They reached the end of the log where the river surged between them and safety. The foal froze, sides heaving, nostrils flaring with panic. Then, across the torrent, the stallion moved. The leader of the herd plunged deliberately into the current, angling his massive chest 3/4 against the flow. Each diagonal step broke the force of water, carving pockets of calm in his wake. He braced, a wall of muscle and instinct, and the message was clear. He was there to bear the storm for the young one. Jace crouched low, lowered the foal into the water, rope taut but gentle. The current pressed the colt sideways, but the stallion's bulk caught it, shielding it from the worst of the flow. The foal pressed instinctively to the older horse's flank, tiny legs churning but steadied by the living barrier beside it. Together they moved, the stallion carrying his burden not with teeth or rope but with presence, step by anchored step toward the far bank. The mares cried encouragement, their voices threading through the roar of the river, and the herd clustered near the shore in readiness. Jace held his breath as the foal's hooves scraped gravel, stumbled, then surged onto solid ground. The bay mare rushed forward, covering her offspring with nuzzles and urgent snorts, her joy so fierce it carried across the torrent. The entire herd answered, neighs and trumpets weaving into a sound that threaded through the valley like an anthem. Jace remained crouched on the slick log, chest heaving, rain still dripping from his hat brim, watching the miracle of reunion. The stallion turned back once, water swirling about his legs. His black eyes found Jace across the torrent. There was no fury now, only a recognition that reached deeper than words. Jace inclined his head, a small gesture of respect. The stallion answered with a low call before stepping into the circle of his herd, where the foal was pressed and guarded on all sides. Jace backed along the log, slow and careful, until his boots found the mud of his own bank. Onyx greeted him with a toss of his wet mane, nostrils flaring as if in approval. By the time Jace gathered his reins, the storm had thinned to a drizzle. The sky streaked with amber and pewter. The foal was safe. The herd was whole. And though a river still divided them, Jace felt less alone than he had in years. Toward evening, as dusk drew down over the settlement of Bitter Creek, the chapel bell tolled across clapboard houses and empty hitching posts. Inside, the air smelled of wax and damp pine, the narrow nave lit by wavering candles. Clara Vaughn sat in the front pew, hands folded, her 34 years etched gently into her face. She wore her chestnut-brown hair pulled back in a knot, gray eyes lifted toward the cross. Her calico dress bore careful mends, but her posture remained unbowed, a quiet dignity born of endurance. She prayed not for riches, nor for escape, but for men of true heart-men whose strength spoke through deed, not boast. Beside her knelt her younger brother Ethan, 11 years old, slim and restless, hazel eyes flickering with the impatience of youth. His shirt was patched, sleeves too short, but his shoulders already squared with defiance. He had defended Jace in the saloon earlier that day, and the image of the cowboy walking into the flood burned bright in his thoughts. Ethan tried to mimic Clara's stillness, hands clenched together, whispering his own prayer that courage like that might one day guide his own steps, and that the town would see such acts as more than folly. Clara glanced at him, hearing his muttered words, and her heart softened. She prayed that her brother would not be hardened by a world too quick to mock and too slow to honor. She prayed that somewhere in the valley good men still lived, and that Providence might guide them into the lives of those who needed them. The candles flickered, shadows stretching against pine boards. Their voices rose with the smoke, quiet but steady, a duet of hope whispered into the rafters. And though they could not know it, miles away a drenched rider led his black Mustang home beneath a sky opening at last, the creek behind him echoing like a quiet amen. At first light, the valley carried the hush of something reborn. The storm spent, but its scars still wet upon the land. The creek ran lower than the night before, though its current still pressed fast against the rocks, carrying the memory of what had almost been lost. Mist rose from the banks like pale smoke, softening the outlines of pines and granite, and in that haze Jace Callahan sat astride Onyx, the black Mustang steady beneath him, body warm and strong against the damp air. His shoulders ached from the battle with the river, his palms raw, yet his eyes held to the opposite bank where the herd remained, their silhouettes cut against the rising sun. The foal he had pulled back from death leaned into its mother's side, alive and breathing, while the stallion watched with a focus that seemed almost human. For a long while, Jace believed they would vanish as dawn widened, slipping into the safety of the hills the way wild horses always had. Yet they stayed. Then, with the deliberate calm of a ruler unhurried by fear, the stallion moved. He stepped forward through the shallows that had appeared overnight as the water dropped, careful and measured, each stride cutting the current at an angle. Droplets fell from his mane like coins of silver as he reached Jace's side of the creek. The stallion halted 10 paces away, nostrils flaring, eyes steady, his chest rising and falling in deep rhythm. What followed struck Jace to the core. The stallion lowered his head, neck bowing long, lips working in a small lick and chew, the kind of gesture horses offered when choosing peace over conflict. It was no accident, no shift of muscle. It carried the weight of choice. The mares behind him did the same, their necks dipping, while colts bent clumsy knees in mimicry. Even the older horses, their coats weathered pale, inclined their heads. They formed not a tight ring but a loose crescent, 10 paces wide, the stallion holding the center line. Jace understood the language, if not the full meaning. He slid from Onyx's back, boots sinking into damp earth, and ground-tied the Mustang a few steps behind him. Onyx flicked his ears but held steady, dark eyes following the stallion, his muscles taut, but his trust in Jace unbroken. Jace walked forward alone, his body angled, hands open at his sides, refusing any stance that might challenge. The stallion's gaze never wavered, and when Jace stopped just short of the space between them, the wild horse reached forward. His muzzle brushed Jace's palm in a fleeting touch, ghosting across skin, gathering his scent. The contact was gone in an instant, but left behind a tremor of understanding so deep Jace felt it burn into his chest. Around him the herd breathed in rhythm, steam curling in the air, hooves pressing the soil into memory. Then, as though the ritual had been sealed, they shifted and parted, opening a path for him to step back. When he returned to Onyx, the stallion lifted his head once more in acknowledgement. Jace mounted, and the herd did not scatter as he expected. Instead, they shadowed him for a distance along the edge of their range, their presence not threatening but watchful, until the trail bent toward the ranch land. There they stopped, a living line across the valley floor, watching as he rode on. Jace knew the memory of that bow, that crescent, would remain with him long after the mist burned away. Back in Bitter Creek, the storm's mark was plain. Roof shingles had torn free, chicken coops overturned, and fences lay broken where the wind had whipped hardest. The townsfolk moved with weary determination, faces smudged with dirt, yet alight with purpose. Clara Vaughn was among them, her chestnut hair tied back, the hem of her calico dress damp from the mud. She moved from house to house without pause, hammering boards across broken windows, tying tarps where shingles were gone, carrying buckets of water to porches where old hands sat exhausted. She had no time for her own troubles. Her compass always pointed outward. Children clung to her skirts as she soothed their cries with a lullaby remembered from childhood. At the churchyard, she organized neighbors into teams, urging the younger men to lift beams while she and other women patched torn clothing and prepared hot food. Her voice was not loud, yet people followed her as though steadied by its calm. The town leaned on her spirit without shame. Among those she guided was Ethan, her 11-year-old brother, thin arms straining as he dragged fallen boards across the square. He stumbled once, knees buckling, but Clara placed a firm hand on his elbow and gave a smile that steadied him. He straightened, jaw set, and carried the beam as though it weighed less than before. When an old ranch hand muttered on Mrs. Dunn's porch that Callahan had dragged a foal from the flood, Clara did not answer. She tucked the news into her chest like a small warm coal as she passed over a patched blanket, the weight of it a quiet comfort. Ethan overheard too, and when his arm shook again later, he thought of the man in the river and found strength enough for one more lift. By late afternoon the clouds broke, letting sunlight glance across wet boards and washed streets. Clara stood in the square with her hands raw from labor, watching neighbors mend fences and pass tools hand to hand. A circle had formed there too, not of horses but of people, each relying on the other to stand again. She smiled, tired but unbroken, and in that smile the town found its anchor. Far beyond, Jace guided Onyx toward his ranch, the memory of the stallion's breath upon his palm heavy in his mind. Two worlds had spoken in gestures older than language, and though neither Clara nor Jace knew it, both had been drawn a step closer to the moment their paths would meet. Morning rose over Bitter Creek with a crispness only found after a storm. The sky stretched in a deep polished blue, the air carrying a sharp clarity of pine and wet earth. Jace Callahan rode Onyx along a ridge where the wild herd had gathered, his body sore from the trial of the river, yet his mind alive with questions. He remembered the night before, the stallion's steady eyes, the foal's recovery, and the circle of horses that had lowered their heads around him in an unspoken gesture of respect. Now, instead of dispersing into the hills, the herd waited as though they had another path for him to follow. Onyx shifted beneath him, ears flicking, the Mustang stallion sensing the tension of what was about to unfold. The slate-gray-led mare moved first, tipping her head upslope and stepping carefully onto a narrow trail that wound between granite outcroppings. The herd flowed behind her with the ease of practiced migration, the great stallion sweeping to the flank, muscles taut as his gaze scanned the wind and the ridges. Young colts jostled but kept to their dam's sides, while the copper-colored foal Jace had saved stayed close to its mother, legs still unsteady but improving with each careful step. Jace knew the foal could not yet climb with the strength of a seasoned animal, and he watched as the bay mare chose the gentlest grades, pausing twice to let her young one catch its breath before urging it onward. Onyx stirred as the herd moved, his body alive with energy, but Jace kept him angled 20 paces off the main file, far enough to show respect. He guided the black stallion along a parallel line, one ridge over, where no tail was crowded and no ear flattened in alarm. The wild herd accepted the distance, and the stallion gave no sign of challenge, his role clear. He was not welcoming an arrival, but tolerating a shadow who understood his place. The climb grew steeper, the air thinner, carrying the resin of cedar and pine. Rocks shifted under hoof, birds scattered at the sound of so many bodies ascending together. Jace leaned forward in the saddle, his muscles aching, yet he felt a strange anticipation build with each turn of the trail. He sensed they were not simply wandering, they were leading him towards something hidden. The trail bent around a sheer wall of granite where water trickled in silver threads, and then, without warning, the world opened. Jace reined Onyx to a halt and stared. Before him lay a valley cupped in stone, a natural amphitheater carved by time. The meadow stretched wide, carpeted in tall grasses swaying under the morning breeze, dotted with wildflowers, blue lupine, yellow balsam root, white asters that caught the sun. A stream cut through the center, clear and sparkling, feeding small pools where the air shimmered with reflected light. Aspens lined the edges, their pale leaves trembling as though whispering secrets. Dozens of horses grazed there, more than Jace would have believed. 2 small bands merged into one, perhaps 3 dozen in all. Their coats shone in the clean air, bays and paints, duns and blacks, some with white blazes, others with coats almost golden. Foals nudged against their mothers, young stallions sparred with mock bites, older mares kept a steady eye on the tree line. The grass was cropped clean, but not ruined, the stream strong enough to keep the valley alive. Movement and balance, not fences or men, governed this place. Onyx's ears pricked forward, his nostrils flaring at the scent of so many kin. He tossed his head, dark mane flying, but held steady under Jace's firm hand. The cowboy dismounted and stood still, boots pressing into damp earth. He did not press deeper into the herd but stopped short of the foals, body turned at an angle, eyes lowered in the language of respect. The mares blinked slowly, drifting aside not because he forced them but because he had given them the choice. The stallion lifted his head and called, a deep, resonant sound that echoed off the cliffs, answered by the chorus of the valley. The air seemed to vibrate with it, a music older than towns, older than ranches, older even than men. Jace's chest tightened at the sound, as though something in him recognized a truth he had been missing his whole life. He glanced toward the copper foal and its mother. The young one tottered forward a step as if to approach, but the mare pressed her nose against its flank, keeping it close, her eyes on Jace wary, yet softened by the stallion's low reassurance. It was not invitation in the way men offered with words, but it was permission in the language of the wild, and Jace felt honored by it. He breathed deeply, letting the moment sink into him, then turned his gaze across the valley once more. Here was no accident of survival, but a sanctuary. Grass, water, shade, and safety, balanced in a fragile order that men could only disrupt. Yet somehow, he had been allowed to see it. Far below in town, Ethan Vaughn paced the narrow porch of the general store. 11 years old, with dark hair that always fell into his eyes and clothes borrowed from his older cousins, he carried himself with a restless energy that masked the weight of worry. Word had spread by morning that no one had seen Callahan since the storm broke. Some muttered that the river had claimed him, others scoffed at the thought of a man riding so close to wild horses and returning whole. Ethan listened, jaw tight, fists curling, but he said nothing. He sat later at the chapel steps when the noon bells rang, chin tucked against his knees. He did not pray in the way others did, but his silence was a kind of plea. He reached into his coat pocket and touched the mended crossbar of a kite Jace had once repaired for him, a memory that steadied his heart the way a knot steadies a line. To Ethan, Jace was more than a ranch hand with muscles like iron. He was proof that a man could stand alone against storm and river and still find compassion for a drowning foal. By dusk, the town fell quiet, lanterns glowing in windows, but Ethan lingered near the river's edge, staring at the ridges where the last light burned. He imagined Jace somewhere out there, maybe lost, maybe found by something greater, and he felt admiration rise above his fear. If Callahan was in the hills, Ethan hoped the wild had found him worth keeping. Back in the hidden valley, the sun dipped low, setting the cliffs ablaze in crimson light. Horses shifted across the meadow, shadows long and fluid. The stallion stood at the heart of them, gaze fixed on Jace. The cowboy understood then that he was not an intruder but a guest, allowed for a moment to share in something sacred. He pressed his palm to Onyx's strong neck, grounding himself as the chorus of neighs rose once more, filling the amphitheater with a song that felt like belonging. Dawn broke with a veil of silver mist draped across the hidden valley, soft light filtering through stands of juniper and cottonwood as the storm-swept night surrendered at last. Jace Callahan stood beside Onyx, his black Mustang, boots sunk into damp soil, eyes fixed on the great herd that had accepted him in their own silent ritual. He still felt the pull of their world, a magnetic gravity that whispered of belonging, but he knew that the thread binding him to this place was meant to stretch, not to tether. The stallion who led them stood forward, his chestnut coat steaming in the chill, muscles corded like carved oak, eyes unreadable, and yet filled with an echo of acknowledgement. The herd stirred as if moved by a single breath, shifting from rest into slow, deliberate formation, their bodies easing into a crescent that faced Jace. Morris pressed close to their foals, colts tossed their heads, and the copper-coated youngster he had saved stepped bravely near the line of elders, ears tipped forward, gaze fixed on the man who had pulled it from the torrent. Onyx shifted his weight, snorting softly, but Jace laid a hand against his thick neck, and the stallion steadied, sharing his rider's calm. The chestnut leader lowered his head, not in submission, but in a solemn gesture of recognition, a long breath huffing through his nostrils as his lips worked in a slow lick and chew. One by one the others followed, each lowering their muzzles, tails flicking in the dawn haze, bodies arranged into a living corridor. It was no perfect circle, no rigid geometry, but a natural avenue, a channel that carried meaning as surely as any spoken words. Jace removed his hat, holding it to his chest, and led Onyx forward on a loose rein, passing slowly between the ranks of wild horses. He walked on foot, boots sinking into the damp earth, his free hand grazing Onyx's shoulder for balance. As he moved, a few muzzles ghosted close enough to breathe against his sleeve before drifting back, a benediction without touch. At the end of the corridor, the copper foal stamped lightly, then, with uncertain legs, took 2 steps toward Jace. The boy inside the man swore he saw gratitude in those dark eyes. Jace crouched, resting his hat against his knee, and the foal edged close enough to brush its muzzle once against his open palm. A spark leapt through the contact, fleeting yet eternal, and then the foal returned to its mother's side. The chestnut stallion gave a low call, deep and resonant, a sound that seemed both an ending and a beginning. Jace led Onyx up the meadow's lip, swung into the saddle, and glanced back one final time. The herd stood still in the mist, their line unbroken, their chorus of low wickers weaving a ribbon of sound that carried across the valley as a farewell. By mid-morning, Jace reached the edge of his own range. Onyx's stride was steady, dark-hide damp but sure, his ears flicking back at each whistle of wind. At the boundary where the valley's high stone rim gave way to the familiar sage flats of Bitter Creek, Jace drew rein. The chestnut stallion had flanked them at a distance, following only so far, then halted, chest heaving, mane rippling in the breeze. For a long moment, horse and man regarded each other across the open space. Then the stallion tossed his head once, a command, a blessing, perhaps both, and turned back toward his herd. Jace tipped his hat, heels nudging Onyx down the trail that wound toward the world of men. Back in the valley, the herd broke formation, the copper foal bounding in short arcs of energy before nuzzling into its mother's side. For Jace, that fleeting touch of its muzzle to his palm was a seal, a bond that would outlast words. By the time he crested the low hills and looked down upon Bitter Creek, the town was stirring to life. Roofs still glistened from the night's rain, streets were churned into mud, and the church bell rang slow, summoning folk to gather for prayer or work. Clara Pritchard stood at the center of it all, her auburn hair tied back in a simple knot, sleeves rolled to her elbows, passing boards hand to hand as neighbors rebuilt a broken fence around the livery. She moved with steady rhythm, a dignity born not from wealth but from resilience, 34 years etched with labor and quiet loss. Since her husband's death, she had carried her younger brother through lean seasons, stitched families together with her kindness, and weathered storms with the same grace she showed now. Ethan spotted Jace first, the boy's lanky frame still awkward at 17, his shirt clinging to shoulders not yet filled out. He broke into a run, boots splashing mud, and halted astride short of Onyx. Jace guided the boy's hand to the saddle blanket, not the bridle, and Onyx lowered his head with a patient snort. Ethan's eyes shone as he whispered, "They said you were lost." Jace only nodded, the lines of his face shadowed by exhaustion, but his silence carried more weight than a speech. Clara had moved closer, her hands still dirty with mud and splinters. Their eyes met, and she gave a small nod of acknowledgement, not prying with questions, but reading in his bearing that something sacred had transpired beyond the town's borders. That night, as the lamps burned in the windows of Bitter Creek, rumors stirred. Some claimed Jace had wandered the storm to mend fence lines. Others swore he had been seen riding north with a string of strange tracks trailing behind him. Luke, the blacksmith, swore that fresh hoofprints in the granite flats matched Onyx's stride, and that mud from the high country still clung to Jace's cinch. Yet Jace spoke nothing of valleys or herds. He kept the memory where it belonged, in the silent chambers of his heart. Days turned to weeks. The creek shrank back into a ribbon of calm water. Fences stood firm, and the town resumed its rhythm. Clara continued to anchor its center, her compassion binding neighbors as surely as rope. Ethan found new confidence, no longer dismissed as a dreamer, for those who had doubted him saw the quiet pride in his eyes whenever he looked at Jace. And sometimes, in the first light of dawn, Jace would ride to the northern ridges of his land and spot a copper foal watching from afar. Never close, never long, but always long enough for Jace to know the bond remained. It was not every day that man and wild beast crossed paths as family, and Jace understood the sacredness of keeping that truth unspoken. Yet as he stood with Clara and Ethan beneath the mending roof of the church, his hands calloused from shared labor, he felt the circle complete. In the valley, a crescent of horses had marked his passage, and in town, a ring of neighbors passed boards from hand to hand. Both worlds had shown him the same lesson. Belonging was not claimed, it was given, and it was given to him. Sometimes the greatest miracles are not written in thunder or fire, but in the quiet bond between creatures, and the kindness that one heart chooses to show another. Just as Jace was accepted by the wild herd, we too are accepted when we choose love, courage, and compassion. It is a reminder that the hand of the Lord works not only in grand displays, but also in the daily moments when we help a neighbor, protect the weak, or forgive someone who has wronged us. In your own life, look for these small miracles. They may come in the smile of a stranger, in the laughter of a child, or in the way creation itself seems to whisper that God's love is always present. If this story touched you, share it with someone who might need hope today. Leave a comment with your thoughts, and do not forget to subscribe to the channel so you will not miss the next journey. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May His grace shine upon your family and your days. If you believe in this miracle of compassion and the power of God's love, write Amen in the comments, and let us carry this light together.